Okay, we are in the midst of the study of the divided kingdom, David's kingdom split in two. And this week we're going to talk about the descent to Ahab. Why do I say descent? What do you mean descent?
He's evil.
Evil? Leonard.
He wasn't always evil per se. He pursued God for a while, but he descended pretty quickly.
Well, I'm thinking of the nation more than just a person. The descent of the nation down into pagan religion. When God sent Moses to the promised land, he told them have nothing to do with Canaanites. In fact, expel them from the land, lest you fall prey to their gods. And really the story of David's kingdom, even through the split and all the way down till they both went into captivity, was the descent, which is sort of common to mankind. It tells you a little bit about human nature. Human nature is not neutral, is it? You turn out the lights in a city and will you find more good than bad? No. Do you have to teach a child to lie? No. Do you have to teach selfishness? No. There is a depravity, as Calvin would say, that characterizes us. And in nations, we do wander away. The amazing thing is that some don't. So we're going to talk about the descent of the northern kingdom down to Ahab. Now, this is the familiar chart that we use to give you the kings after the kingdom divided. Remember, the unified kingdom was under David, and then, well, Saul, David, and then Solomon, and Solomon's son, Rehoboam, up here on his coronation day, had the kingdom ripped from him, and 10 tribes out of 13 actually became the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. Now, before we jump into this, I was just, I've stared at this a lot longer than you have. And something bothers me about this. You'll notice that, these are the years they ruled, the number of years they ruled. There's some details about their reign. This is who was murdered and killed. And these are the prophets that, serviced during their time. But the color of this particular column, red or green, tells you whether God evaluated them as having done evil in the sight of the Lord or having done good. Was this a good king? Was this a bad king? Good guys, bad guys. And there is an evaluation verse I have found for every single king, with the exception of one who didn't last a couple of months. I mean, he wasn't there long enough. So every king's got an evaluation. God, in his word, gives an evaluation. Every king is both good and bad. Every king does good and does bad of some sort. But God evaluates them at the end of their life. Well, how will he evaluate you and me? Have we been faithful? Have we not? But the thing that bothers me is, you notice the kingdom of Judah has red and green. The kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, has nothing but red. Does that bother you? Well, why would God give one kingdom revival, kings that were good, that turned the nation toward the Lord, and not give it to another kingdom? They're all Israelites, right? I mean, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's translate that to today. Why is it infinitely more probable that my child should come to faith in Christ and be saved from eternal fire, and the child of a Pakistani suicide bomber will never hear the gospel and has no idea? Why are there nations where there are no revivals? We've been through we've had how many awakenings? You historians. I know there's first great awakening, second great awakening. I think there's a third. And then there was the Jesus movement in the 70s, right? And we're all praying for a revival today, right? So we've seen that, but the trajectory of our nation seems to be declining as well. It's kind of a roller coaster, right? And it goes down like that. But in the midst of decline, we are seeing moments where God has given us favor. But there are other nations where he hasn't done that at all. Why is that? Lynn and I got into that this week. We were having quite a time talking about it. Why is it that some nations never hear or never seem to have God's favor? Remember, God deals with us as individuals, every individual in the world, and he deals with people as nations. What would keep a nation from experiencing those good things? Leadership. Let's, you hit the right one. And I didn't pay for that. This is perfect. Sins of the fathers to begin with. See, Rehoboam was a tragic figure because he lost his kingdom and it didn't have anything to do with him. Why did he lose his kingdom? Why did God split his kingdom apart and take it from him?
Because the punishment of Solomon was not given to Solomon because of David, the favor to David, but it was going to be to his son.
Okay, it was to be given to his son, but why was the punishment given at all? What had he done?
Because Solomon left the Lord and went after the Canaanite gods.
Solomon married outside the will of God those princesses or women who served Canaanite gods. In fact, he wanted to make sure that they felt comfortable, so he actually built them temples on the Mount of Olives to their gods. Chemosh, Molech had temples outside Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives so that Solomon's wives could worship their Canaanite gods. And God said to Solomon that he would punish him by taking the kingdom, his kingdom, and destroying it and just splitting it into two. And so he did, but it was given to Rehoboam. So Jeroboam is a terrible character because, not because he was such a terrible idolater, but because he started the nation on the path down to idolatry. And the way he did that was to confuse the people between worshiping Jehovah and worshiping idols. He set those two calves up. He said, now these calves are the Lord. They're your God. Alvin, you got something?
Yes, but to remember that God came to him through a prophet and said, if you follow me with all your heart like King David did, I will cause your throne and your family to be blessed like David's family for all time. So it wasn't a lack of God's promise. It was a lack of his faithfulness.
That's right. The sins of the father, right? So Jeroboam's sin is mentioned in every single king's evaluation statement, except this guy Shalom that nobody knows. Okay, every single one. Besides that, he did evil according to the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Sins of the father. Let me give you another one. This was Len's idea. He said the size of the remnant. There is in every nation a remnant, isn't there? You can go anywhere, and if you look hard enough, you will find God's true worshipers. I mean, I could say that from experience, having gone on to Navy ships, carriers, where Kitty Hawk in '73 had absolutely no Christian activity outside of the formal service that they had to have on the forecastle. And yet I managed to find 3 or 4 guys who loved the Lord Jesus, who wanted to get together. And I learned a little bit about ecumenism. We would meet in a compartment, smelled of fuel. I wasn't sure that was the guys I was with or the compartment, but they, we have called grapes because they wear purple shirts and they fuel the airplanes. They're soaked in fuel. And they don't understand much. They're as charismatic and Pentecostal as you can come, and I'm not. And they were very ignorant of Scripture. But you know what? They knew the Lord Jesus. There's a remnant in Revelation chapter 5. All the saints in the world, the angels, heaven and earth, are proclaiming the glory of the Lamb of God. And they say, for with your blood, you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. So there's a remnant in every nation. Remember, Elijah goes to Mount Horeb. We're going to see that later on. And he meets God and he whines and he complains. He says, I'm the only one left. What did God tell him? There are 7,000 people who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And I've always thought of that as meaning there's lots of my faithful servants.
Actually, he said, I have kept for myself
Okay.
7,000 who have not bowed the knee to. He is always going to have, because of who he is, he's always going to have a faithful follower. You know, in the New Testament where it says, go back out and get the rest of the unlikely and can't make them come to my banquet hall, because my banquet hall will be full. And I think that that's the reason why he kept 7,000.
But you know what? 7,000 is not a whole lot. I know,
That's right.
for the size of the, what, 2 million?
Well, let's just assume, to take the muster an army of 800,000 men, that they had about 2.5 million people. All right, 7,000 is less than 0.3%. That's a tiny, tiny remnant.
But the 7 is significant.
Okay, the 7 is significant. But it-
It is.
It's that he uses 7,000.
So that's just.
What does it mean?
The 7 is his number for completion and perfection.
Well, it's pretty complete and perfect. So I think 7,000 were 7,000.
Okay.
I don't think he means just a lot of complete people, but I think he means 7,000. But the point is, that's not a lot of people. That's a very small number. We were having dinner at, I think it was the Toad Vines, and there was 8 of us, and Bob and Judy Russell were at that dinner. And we got to talking about the church and things and how rotten things have gotten. And those conversations can sort of cascade in that direction. And we're getting ready to leave. And Bob Russell says, hey, now remember, God told Abraham he would have saved Sodom if he could find 10 righteous. We got 8 right here. All we need to do is go find 2 more. I love that optimism. And the size of the remnant matters. And the question is the remnant in our land, which is quite large, shrinking? And we should be doing all we can to prevent that shrinkage, shouldn't we? The size of the remnant does matter. But the most important aspect of it is the sovereign purposes of God. Why does God continue to work through this channel and not this channel so much? What's important about this channel?
It's the line. Jesus is line.
That's the lead to the Redeemer, to the one who was promised in Genesis 3. Do you remember God promised Adam and Eve that after they sinned, he said, I will create enmity between the serpent and the woman, between his seed and her seed. He shall crush the serpent's head, although the serpent will bruise his heel. He's talking about the fact that God intended from the very beginning at the fall that he would bring redemption to mankind through someone who was the seed of the woman. And the struggle in the Old Testament is all about the conflict of the seeds. Satan did everything he could to either pollute the seed of the woman, as he did before the flood, or to kill the people through whom the seed would come. That would be Pharaoh trying to kill all the children, or Herod killing all the baby boys in Bethlehem. And the opposition of Satan is constant all through the Old Testament. And the struggle is to bring the Messiah into the world safely. And you know, I remember reading, listening, or watching Gibson's Passion of the Christ. And I think I've mentioned this before. And the devil character is kind of, in the background. How many have seen it? Yeah, okay. He's sort of wandering in the background, and he's obviously going to do everything he can to destroy the Christ. And in Christ Jesus is on the cross, and he says, it is finished. And that character is standing there all alone, falls to his knees and shrieks this horrible cry of defeat. Because he has been defeated in preventing the redemption of mankind. So it doesn't matter what men were going to do. It doesn't matter the fortunes of Israel or anyone else. God will accomplish his purpose. And no man can stop it. And so if it means that he has to bring revival to certain nations and work in certain nations in ways that he doesn't work in others, I'm sorry, that's just the way he goes. He says, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. That's hard for me to accept. It doesn't seem fair. But the remnant is much larger here than the remnant is here. And God's sovereign purposes are fulfilled here. They're not being fulfilled through these guys. Does that mean there were no people that believed? Of course not. There were 7,000 that hadn't bowed the knee to Baal. God works with us as nations, but he also works with us as individuals. I want to start with that. One of the things that impresses me is it's really amazing when you think about it, that there are good green kings and nations that turn to the Lord at all. That there are any that are saved. In fact, Jesus says in Luke chapter 14, he says, well, let me see if I can read that to you, because I want to catch something about the beginning that I don't remember. Luke 18. He says, and will not God, he's talking about the unjust judge and the comparing him. He said, will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And I've always wondered about that last sentence. What does that mean? He said, will not God bring justice for those who cry out to him day and night? And I think what he's saying is, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find anybody crying out? Will he find anyone that seeks after him? So we've talked about Judah. Each one of the kings has a lesson to teach us. And I don't want to dwell on them, except this is an expansion of it. If you get the slides, gives you a little bit more detail so you can keep the outline in your head. Rehoboam, of course, taught us about the sins of the fathers and how they affect him. Abijah made a speech, but we talked about the importance of the heart and how God deals with the heart. And that actually is true everywhere. Asa was the first great king, the first good one. The lesson we learned from him was to finish strong. Remember, he failed to finish strong. And we think that's because he leaned his faith on someone who was his mentor, maybe his mother. And when she died, he fell away. And so the lesson there was to labor diligently to make your faith your own. Make sure that it is you who know Christ and not the person you lean on. Okay, failed to finish strong. And then we've got Jehoshaphat. That was last week. He was a wise and a good king. He was a great king. He actually brought in more wealth, more power, more revival. He was the guy that actually went out himself personally, and he trained the citizens in the word of God. That's awesome. He had teams going out into the country, and then he would go with them, and he would bring a copy of the book of the law, that would be Moses, the books of Moses, and he would train them, and he would turn the hearts of the people back to the Lord. And he destroyed the high places that were used for pagan worship. I mean, Jehoshaphat was a good guy, and God gave him this huge, enormously wonderful battle that he didn't have to fight, but God destroyed his enemies. I mean, those are great things. But what was his weakness? Friends. Right? He didn't realize, I mean, I think he was the kind of guy who was gregarious. He loved people. He liked to be around them. He had a good time. And he wanted peace between the northern and southern kingdom. And he just came to like Ahab and Ahab's family and what they did when he was up in Samaria with them. And the problem was he got entangled with a wicked man and a family that was an enemy of God. Resulted almost in his own life being lost, plus the lives of many of his soldiers. But later on, when we return to Jehoshaphat, we will see how it destroyed his own kingdom and almost destroyed the line of David. So one other thing that we found out when we talked about this last battle and this experience that he had, Jehoshaphat, with Ahab, we discover what a scoundrel Ahab was. He's devious, he's a crook, and he was a bad man to be entangled with. Now, this is the timeline that shows you how the various kings phased over time. You can see Jeroboam and Rehoboam. This would be the southern kingdom, northern kingdom. And then you have these other kings. So we're going to go through them real quick. The thing to remember is that good or bad, the kings of Judah never lost the throne of David. And why is that?
God made sure they didn't.
God
God made sure they didn't.
made sure they didn't, right? Because he had a covenant. Right. We talk a lot about covenant in this class. He had made a covenant with David that there would always be someone on his throne. Matter of fact, when Jeroboam was prophesied, as Alvin was saying, that he would take the kingdom from Rehoboam, this is what the prophet said. 1 Kings 11, 35 to 36, and then 39.
I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. Verse 39, I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever.
Okay. The reason that they retained the throne of David was because God had promised that he would always have a lamp to sit on the throne of David. And that means always. He would humble David during the exiles and subsequent years, but that throne would always be filled. And God's sovereign purposes are being fulfilled regardless of what we do. Now, the Northern Kingdom kind of had a different story. They went through one king, they had musical kings. You had Jeroboam, then Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, all the way down to Ahab, all during Asa's reign. One king had six others, excuse me. There were 10 dynasties in 200 years. Now, that's not 10 kings, that's 10 dynasties. So they were constantly changing. One would slaughter the previous king and then start a new dynasty. Now, because we have gone this far in David's line to Jehoshaphat, we want to stop there, okay, for a minute, because Jehoshaphat got so entangled with Ahab over here that let's go ahead back here and bring ourselves down to Ahab so we get a better picture, and then we'll talk about how that proceeded together. Now, first of all, you got Jeroboam. His leadership was the one that split the kingdom. Jeroboam's interesting. I think he's the best leader of all in Israel's history. He is a self-made man, raised by a single mother, and yet he rose to the pinnacle of power. He was the only king that was actually selected by the people to be their king. Everybody else was either became the king by assassinating or killing the previous king or being born to the king's family. So he was a unique guy. But what made him so unique was that he sent the nation of Israel on track toward idolatry. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. His son, natural descent, Nadab, only served 2 years. Nadab, can't say much. He was in the field besieging a Philistine city, and he was assassinated by his own people. The guy that assassinated him was this fellow Baasha. Baasha was a strong man. He actually ruled for 24 years. He was wicked. The first thing that he did is he slaughtered every single descendant and member of Jeroboam's family. And that's what you did when you won the election. You go, if the Democrats win the election, they kill every Republican. The Republicans win the election, they kill every Democrat, just to make sure there's no competition. And we kind of think that's crazy and that's way off. But no. That is the way of the world. You know. Just to give you an example, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party became the majority party in Reichstag in the 1930s, within a year, 79,000, Shira tells us, 79,000 people who were his party's political enemies disappeared, either into prison or into heaven. They were gone. That's not unusual. In fact, we are conditioned to think that peace is the natural state of mankind. We have reached the end of history. Everything is going to be done by international organizations and goodwill and hands across the sea and blah, 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 blah. But unfortunately, those pesky little wars keep coming up and the cruelty of man keeps being shown to us.
Yes, it's happening today in China and Iran.
Mhm.
There's people protesting in China right now. People are not going to find them. And
Well, imagine now in Iran, should a leader like Khomeini rise up to take the part of the rebels, the people that are revolting, should they gain control, then the next thing to do would be to slaughter everyone that was in the current administration. That's what goes on.
January 6th is political prisoners too.
Yeah. So Baasha slaughters everybody. And he actually rules for 24 years. He was the guy we talked about that besieged Judah in the days of Asa, and he blockaded the road. Remember that? Put a blockade on the road so that he could starve them out. And Asa had to deal with that. Okay. Well, then you go to his son, Elah, just like Nadab was Jeroboam's son. It lasted 2 years. Elah only lasted 2 years as well. And he was killed while he was in a drunken stupor in the palace. These are really high-class people. He's drinking it up and having a good time in the palace. And one of his generals, a guy is responsible for half the chariots, I guess, name was Zimri. Now, Zimri is my favorite. You talk about a loser. Zimri rules for a grand total of 7 days. Now, if you're going to conduct a coup and it doesn't last for more than 7 days, you have done something wrong. And what he did wrong was he failed to realize you need control of the army, right? So he goes ahead and he kills his predecessor, Elah. Within 7 days, he goes out and he slaughters every member of Baasha's family line and their officials and their friends, male and female. So you really don't want to know people in power in those days. So he does that within 7 days, and he declares himself king. And meanwhile, the army is out besieging a city not too far away, and they hear the word of that and say, we're not going to buy this. So they get together, they have powwow, and they elect one of their members, name of Omri. Okay, sounds like you ought to have a hotel. But Omri is the guy that they select to lead. And what he does is he marches back on the capital city to take it and to kill Zimri. Now, I'll let the passage speak for itself. 1 Kings 16, 16 to 18.
When the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day there in the camp. Then Omri and all the Israelites with him withdrew from Gibbethon and laid siege to Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him. So he died.
Don't you love that? It's kind of like Ulrika in Ivanhoe. She burns the castle around her and she stands up on the parapet screaming curses at her enemies. I mean, this is real. This is what happened. He saw the city was taken and said, well, I guess my time's up. Burns himself alive. Pretty great. Omni then proceeded to try and gain control. It took him a few years. He only ruled for 12 years. It took him several years to gain control because he had a rival. So there's a little civil war. But then he does something that made a big difference, and that was he built the city of Samaria. Now, Samaria, in that day, is built up on a high hill, and it is a glorious, beautiful city. It was built to be the latest and the greatest and the most modern and the most exciting capital city to the glory of the king. Okay, so they had everything there. They had all the best restaurants. They had the convention centers. They had all the things that would go with a really vibrant, powerful, glittering city. Everything was new, was built for the purpose. And he died, and Ahab was the one that took over from him, who reigned 22 years and lived in that city. Now, I think one of the reasons that Jehoshaphat, down here, got involved with Ahab's family was Samaria. Think about it. Jehoshaphat lives in this old, ancient, musty old castle, fortress city of Jerusalem. Not all that exciting a life. Here's this glittering city, right? This is the latest and the greatest. And when he goes up to visit the king up there, they party hard and they have a great time. And he likes what he does when he's with them. See? And I think that's how he became inveigled into Ahab's orbit and eventually got too close. Now, he ruled for 22 years. He's really only there as a foil for Elijah. I mean, you look now, we're going to talk about 6, 7 chapters all about the life of Elijah. And that's all during Ahab's reign. So it's really, that's his purpose. But he marries Jezebel. And I got a picture of Jezebel. I know what Jezebel looked like. And you know, I go looking for graphics a lot in these things, and we'll get to her. But when I think of her, man, I think of this one picture. She's awesome. She's just nasty. You could just tell this girl's dangerous. And she was the daughter of the king of Sidon, which was a Canaanite city up to the north in Phoenician city in Lebanon. And she was the priestess of Baal and Asherah. Okay, so he marries her, and she intimidates him. I mean, Ahab is a little scared of this girl. Okay, so he doesn't want to get on her bad side. The one time that he does, she just tears him up. We'll see about that after Mount Carmel happens. But he's kind of a petticoat government. You know what I mean? Have you heard that phrase? Mama rules the roost. But the thing is, because of that and who she was and what she brought in, the one thing that they did was they committed the entire nation to Baal worship. 16:30-33, Jack.
Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the other kings of Israel before him.
Now, in the past, all the kings paid lip service to the worship of the Lord, of Yahweh, of Jehovah, the God of Israel. I mean, they were still Israelites, but they ignored or they fostered the additional practices that went on in the high places that were Canaanitic in nature. What's changed now is that Ahab and Jezebel have decided to make Canaanite religion the state religion, the only form of worship that is acceptable. And so inevitably, when that happens, they begin to persecute those who are the Lord's servants. Does that sound familiar? And that's really what I want to try to get you all to see as we go through this, that we are in a descent like anybody else, just like them. And we are the remnant that needs to do all we can to redeem it. Even Jeroboam, when he started things off back at the beginning, remember he put the two calves up there, one at the southern end and one at the northern end of the country. And he said, look, you can worship the Lord up here in Dan or in Bethel, make it convenient for you. It's perfectly okay for you to worship God. Just use this calf as sort of a picture of him. Now, Jeroboam's great sin was that he brought those calves in to personify Jehovah. These people didn't worship cows, okay? They understood that these images, these idols, these animals that were sacred and things like that were representations of a God in the spirit world. So they understood that the cow didn't have intrinsic value, but they used that symbol to identify a God of some sort. And the calves in Dan and Bethel actually provided that transition from Yahweh to Baal, because Baal's symbol was the bull. See how they would get confused? So in the calf idols, we've got this identification of the God of Mount Sinai with Baal himself, because his symbol was so similar. And you see this go on over and over. In Exodus, this started, didn't it? Moses is up on the mountain. All the people come to Aaron and say, this guy Moses is gone. We give us a God. Here's our earrings. Make us something. He makes them a golden calf, right? Same thing. And he turns to the people and he says, here, O Israel, are the gods that led you, or is the Lord who led you out of Egypt. This calf represents the Lord. And then they began to feast and they began to revel and they began to go completely out of control worshiping this calf, and Moses understood how dangerous that was. And he came down and he called those who were loyal to the Lord to him, and it cost 3,000 lives to restore order, didn't it? But that was the end of the calf in Israel's life. That was leadership. That was strong leadership. Well, so as time goes on, Baal and Asherah, we'll talk about who they are in a bit, become confused with the Lord. And there's something interesting about this pottery shard. This is a piece of a pot that was decorated that has been found, and it's dated to the 8th century BC, which would be the 700s, maybe 50 to 100 years after what we're doing. Okay. Go to NBC News. NBC News has under its science news section an article entitled "God's Wife Edited Out of the Bible, Almost." And here's what the author says, quote, "God had a wife, Asherah, whom the book of Kings suggests was worshipped alongside Yahweh in his temple in Israel, according to an Oxford scholar." An Oxford scholar said that. The Oxford scholar doesn't impress me with the scholarship. The temple of Yahweh was in Judah, not in Israel. And when there was an Asherah pole or an idol erected in the temple, God, the real God of Israel, condemned it roundly. We know that. We read this stuff all the time, but Oxford scholars apparently don't. Now, referring to this pottery shard, this scholar says, quote, "The inscription up there is a petition for a blessing. Crucially, the inscription asks for a blessing from Yahweh and his Asherah. Here was evidence that presented Yahweh and Asherah as a divine pair, and now a handful of similar inscriptions have since been found, all of which help to strengthen the case that the God of the Bible once had a wife," unquote. Do you get to that from there? What that tells me is that the Israelites began to get confused between the religion that worshiped the God of Israel and the Canaanite religions. But not only were they deceived, here, an Oxford scholar is deceived and has the idea that God actually had a wife. That's crazy. That's beyond my understanding. Now, notice a couple things about this. I'll just give you this. Imagine this guy's writing things he sees. He's trying to draw things he sees. And he's got these priests that are dancing around, and they're covered in tattoos or piercings. Gives you an idea what they might have looked like. They have these fantastic headdresses. Imagine feathers coming out all over the place. And their sexual organs are visible. And they look a little bit like something out of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Just really wild and crazy. In the background, you have the female. It's all tatted up too, as well, same way, with a lyre, and she's playing the music, and they're dancing to it. And then you have this pair, and it says, Yahweh and his Asherah will bless us. Now, I get my notes ready. This is a temple in Palmyra, which is a little bit later in time, more toward maybe a couple hundred years later, but this is the temple of Baal Shaman, also known as the Lord of the Heavens. So who are Baal and Asherah? Let's ask that question first. The word Baal means master, and there were tons of them. Every country, every city had a different version of Baal, but it was a master. He is the son of El, the god of the rain and the storm. And so he's the one that is the farm god. He's the god of wealth, of success in the agrarian society. You want to have good crops. It's Baal that's going to give you rain because they had a dry country. Okay. So he had a consort whose name was Asherah. We see her as Astarte, Ishtar, Ashtoreth in other, social settings. But she was the goddess of fertility. So she's often portrayed very sexually, and the goddess of war. And so she's preoccupied with sex and with violence. Why is it that sex outside of God's plan always seems to gravitate toward violence? You ever notice that? Because of Satan. I suppose. Yeah. The misuse of God's gift leads to evil. It always does. You know, we have S&M, bondage, violence in sexual activity. In our TVs, with you know, there are TV shows that make, you know, fun of that, as though that's perfectly acceptable. Sex and violence. So Baal is the god of prosperity and of rain and of success, and she was the goddess of sex and violence and fertility. And we're now, having seen that, and imagine what he's looking at when he writes those pictures, what makes these two so attractive? Why are people drawn to them? I mean, it seems that no matter what the king does, if he just relaxes his guard and sits back, then this idolatry breaks out all over the country. Why is that? Well, first of all, I think these gods make no demands contrary to our sinful hearts. I want you to remember that phrase, because in a minute we're going to see something about it. Pagan idolatry makes no demands contrary to our sinful hearts. So if you want to do what you want to do, this is where you want to be. Aldous Huxley used to say, he wrote that he wanted to be, he did not want there to be a God. He wanted there to be no God because he wanted the sexual freedom that God was preventing him from having. He's wide open about it. He wanted to be libertine. But beyond that, they appeal to our lusts. Remember, success, wealth, fertility, sex, violence. 1 John 2, verse 15 tells us about those things. Go ahead, Jack.
Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him.
Keep going. For the
How
go
far
to
are we
16. I'm sorry. Keep
Okay.
going.
For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever.
Now, I can't think of any sinful activity that doesn't come under one of those three characteristics. Any sinful lust. The lust of the eyes, that's money, stuff, things, the stuff we all crave and try to get, all the toys we can before we die. The lust of the flesh, that's the pleasures of life, whether it's sexual or gluttony or drugs or whatever. We all crave pleasure. We want to feel good. And the pride of life, the idea of being powerful, having status, being famous, having the power over others, and violence, the ability to inflict violence. That's pretty much maps it all. I don't think of anything else. So they appeal to our lusts. And when you look at Baal and Asherah and what they stand for, that's exactly the three things that they're going for. Now, what was their worship like? Well, I'll just give you what I know about it. Wild, ecstatic dancing, drunkenness, and music that ends up in orgiastic sex. Provided male and female prostitutes for gay and straight sex in chambers provided in these groves, these little groves at the top of the hill. Now, sex had a religious significance. The idea was it was supposed to motivate Baal and Asherah to copulate and thus bring the world to life again in the spring. I'm not so sure how many men were thinking about Baal and Asherah. But especially during the summer months when this land had already come to life, they had ritual meals, some of which were often ghoulish. I wanted to understand this a little bit more, and I did some reading, and I just, the horror, like, you can't talk about these things. Some of the things that they did are so horrible. I couldn't repeat them here without many of you really being offended. It's just disgusting. It's ghoulish what they did. Well, those things are being done mostly out of sight, though. You don't see them being favored by the state or by the law, right? No, not yet. No, you think the law accepts human sacrifice and things like that?
I don't think the law does, but I think many of the lawmakers do and are.
Well, there may be. What I'm saying, as far as the culture goes, the culture is defined by its laws and its cultural practices. We are seeing these things begin to intrude, but they haven't yet become part of our national life, but they may well. they're getting started. I agree with that.
I think the results of the sex and the wild activity results in a baby that is as abortion.
I agree.
And a veil, it's a sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's modern day.
Yeah, like I say, I think we're going in that direction. That's the whole point of this idea of descent, which we want to talk about just a minute. Then animal sacrifices also went with their worship, and they eventually led to child sacrifices. And I want to read to you some of McAllister, a guy by the name of McAllister, who did some excavation of these high places and what he found. Jack, why don't you read that first passage?
Under the debris in this high place, McAllister found a great number of jars containing the remains of children who had been sacrificed to Baal. The whole area proved to be a cemetery for newborn babes.
And in that sense, what you just said, Deborah, is very true about our society. Doug said it. Okay, good. Yeah, we talk about it. Okay. We may look down our nose at people who took their babies and threw them into the fire, but I can't see how that's much different than dismembering them as they come out of the womb. Tyler, you got something? Yeah, okay. But there's more to that. Go ahead, give us the second passage there, McAllister.
Another horrible practice was that they called what they called foundation sacrifices. When a house was built, a child would be sacrificed and its body built into the wall to bring good luck to the rest of the family. Many of these were found in Gezer. They have been found also at Megiddo, Jericho, and other places.
Oh, this is something else. You build a building or a house, and you throw a child into the foundation, or you wall him up in the wall. And some of these were slaves and children that were buried alive. And the idea was that they would provide a ghost, and the ghost would watch over the structure and bring good luck to its occupants. Have you organized your house along feng shui guidelines so that you're lying down in your bedroom north and south with your head to the south so that you're in line with the magnetic field of the earth, and that will bring you good luck and all that? Well, those are fairly harmless superstitions, you would think. But these superstitions are all of the same cloth. You know how sometimes bedrock appears in different places in the countryside, but there's a connection between them. There's an illustration during Ahab's time, it says. This happened in the city of Jericho, 1 Kings 16:34.
In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun.
Now, Joshua did pronounce a prophecy. He said, after Jericho was destroyed, he says, if anybody tries to rebuild it, may he build it in the life of his son. May his sons be in the foundation sacrifice. And that's exactly what happened. So they were doing this in Ahab's time. So this marks pretty much the lowest point in the descent of Israel to this time. And this is so bad that God decides to move in power. I think that's something we all want. God, will you please raise up your right hand and do something about this? And Elijah comes to the fore, and he emerges in 1 Kings 17:1. Jack?
Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word.
He comes out of nowhere. We know he's a Tishbite, and we'll talk a little bit about what he was, but we don't have any introduction here. Elijah just comes on the scene, and the first thing he does is he pronounces judgment on the God of rain and storm, the one that brings crops, to the one that gives them their prosperity. He says, the rain will not fall until I say so. He's identifying himself as God's messenger. And so this begins the story of Elijah that we're going to jump into here pretty soon. So now, it wasn't easy, because at this time, as inevitably happens, Jezebel's people began to persecute God's prophet and kill them off. You remember in In chapter 18, Obadiah comes to see, he runs into Elijah, and Elijah says, tell Ahab I'm here. And he says, I'm not doing that. What's the matter with you? You're gonna disappear, and then he's gonna kill me. Do you know what I'm doing? I am hiding the prophets of the Lord in caves, and I'm feeding them out of the palace household, out of their food account. He said, I'm a good guy. I'm not a bad guy. So he was trying to push back on this persecution. Now, I want to stop at that point with Israel and ask you the question, do you see signs of a descent from the worship of the biblical God to paganism as we've described it? How?
Well, you've probably seen the controversy with the designer Balenciaga and the photo shoots they did. If you dive into the woman who organized those photo shoots and the people who designed them, and you dig into what they're doing, it's pretty awful. And in many of their photo shoots, they spell the name, they add an A to the Balenciaga and they spell it B-A-A-L and C.
Okay. It never gave us the sign of abortion.
Yeah, abortion, but drag queens and it's all very out there. I said to Ken last night, there was some commercial for a concert. And I said, why does that guy not have a shirt on? You know, it was just advertising the concert coming up. And he said, because it's just descending. It's going to be completely out on the screen all the time. You know, this descent into this, you know, anything goes, doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. You might want to send your children to the B.M. Williams Primary School in Chesapeake, Virginia, where they have the little, hey kids, let's have fun at the After School Satan's Club, Science and Community Service Projects. Doesn't that sound great? Benevolence and empathy, critical thinking, problem solving. And then there's the Satanic Temple is a non-theistic religion that views Satan as a literary figure who represents a metaphorical construct of rejecting tyranny. Who's the tyrant? The Lord is the tyrant. Rejecting tyranny and championing the human mind and spirit. So now you can go there, you know, on these dates, 2:30 in the afternoon for an hour. Your kids can get a little bit of this wholesome, healthy affirmation of the human spirit. Here.
Disney's movie, The Santa Clauses. Disney's movie, The Santa Clauses, that's coming out or maybe is out now, has in plain sight children holding up letters that say, "We love you, Satan."
Not surprising. Let me give you a little, well, first of all, the C.S. Lewis book, the Screwtape Letters, Screwtape's an old demon, although senior demon, and he's trying to educate his apprentice, Wormwood, and he tells Wormwood one of the most impressively effective things you can do is to get people to believe that the devil is just a metaphorical construct.
There you go.
Leonard.
Trinity College at Cambridge, there was a professor, I think it was this week or last week,
Yes.
who proclaimed that Jesus had a transgender body. Well, actually, and the dean of the college supported him strongly. And there was a lot less backlash than there should have been.
Sorry.
That goes to middle school.
Yeah. Okay. Middle school, GSAs, Thursdays, Gender Sexuality Alliance. I understand. All that stuff's happening. Let me give you one more here. This is the University of Massachusetts. Massachusetts has leading in this thing. This is the Spiral's website. You could go to their meetings on Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. and student pagans interpreting religion and life spirituality. Now, this is some of the things they said. I just want to read them to you. Paganism is a quickly growing spiritual movement consisting of various groups practicing nature-based polytheistic religions, loosely based on the religions of the ancient world. This is the old devil coming back again. Our beliefs are incredibly varied, coming from various traditions. a reverence for nature in the physical world, and belief in a non-authoritarian religion. What I tell you, remember from before? Yeah, we have no authority here. This is just do your own thing. Pagans view the world as a place of joy and life, not sin and suffering. I mean, that's a first world perspective. Let me tell you, if you lived in some parts of Nigeria, you might feel differently about it. We believe that the divine is here with us in the natural world, not in some faraway place in the sky, heaven. We hold a deep reverence for nature and the earth. Pagans tend to be earth conscious. Much of the environmental movement. Yes.
The Leslie thing is not happening here, Alvin, send me a thing from the Mesquite Middle School. I'm trying to find the email. He said,
Yeah.
that's right there.
Yeah. Okay. So but look at these statements. Don't they sound good?
No.
Well, not to you, but I mean, just to people in general. But it's a quickly growing movement. It's spiritual. It practices nature-based polytheistic religions loosely based on the ancient world. Our beliefs are all over the place. Reverence for nature, physical world, belief in non-authoritarian religion.
Isn't this just straight out of Romans 1? They were.
Absolutely. It's a place of joy. It's not sin and suffering. Christians are all did it because you run around sorrowful about sin. Why don't you embrace life?
I almost see a contradiction. It says in the first paragraph, paganism is a quickly growing spiritual movement, indicating implying that it's new. Residence is later loosely based on the religions of the ancient world.
Yeah.
Is it new or not?
It is new to our society because America, for example, or the West has been based on Christendom. So all our institutions have biblical roots. And so this is new to us. I mean, most of what you have brought up things have expressed your horror if these things are happening. Why? Well, because you have a different set of values. You have a different foundation, right? The foundation is being destroyed and new things are coming up. Now, all this sounds good. Joy, life, the divine is here with us in the natural world. We affirm everybody. The problem is that there is a direct connection between all this wonderful earth worship and things like that and the ovens. There is. When you take away the idea of God having created us for a purpose and having governed us through his law and his moral universe and the image of God in man, there's nothing that will stop you. Matter of fact, Dostoevsky said, famous statement, he said, when God no longer exists, then anything is possible. And that means exterminating your enemies. That means killing the Jews. That means killing off the unfit, eugenics, whatever may come up. It's all acceptable. Okay. I don't know if you've ever read That Hideous Strength. Anybody done that? Yeah, I'll get you to read. Len, you read it? I read books I read. I very rarely ever read one twice, but I read this one twice. C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. It's built, written in 1946, but it is all about this descent and how that which looks sophisticated and wonderful and progressive has roots that go deeply down into paganism. Interesting. It's about a fellow by the name of Mark Studdick who really lusts to be a part of the inner circle of this new institute at the university called the National Institute for Health and Care. For coordinated experiments. And their idea is we're going to use science to to fix mankind and to bring about nirvana or to bring about utopia. And he wants to be part of it in the worst way. And he gets caught in this vortex. And at the bottom of it, he finds magic and all of the stuff that was in those previous slides. Now, think about the NICE, N-I-C-E, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. In the UK today, which is where he wrote that book, there is an institute called the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Nice. That's it provides national guidance and advice to improve health and social care. But what that means is to decide who gets life-saving care and who doesn't. The NICE.
respect for marriage and
I think it's Orwellian, right? So as soon as Jezebel became the queen, she started to harass and destroy the remaining prophets of the Lord in Israel. She crossed the line from tolerating idolatry to idolatry no longer tolerating the Lord. And I think we see that already in our country, because we say, well, we just want to live and let live. We don't want the gay community or whatever else other community to be persecuted. We simply want to live our own life. Fine. Now you cannot live your life without being canceled. Now, what are we going to do? Do we need a prophet? I think we do. In the 1930s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer felt the same way. He saw the Nazis were beginning to take control of the German church and claim that they were the real German church. And so he and some friends, they started a church called the Confessing Church. My tutor, when I lived there as a student, was a member of the Confessing Church. Martin Niemöller is famous. He's the one that said, first they came for the socialists. I did not speak out because I was a socialist and blah, 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 you know. And then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. Famous. He spoke out. Now, they created a thing called the Barmen Declaration, which got them all in trouble because it opposed all of the things that the Nazis were doing against the Jews and against the church. And they defied him. And as a result, many, many pastors went into the concentration camps. Many of them were killed. But they became an influencer. They were what I call turning point influencers. Asa was a good king, and he came from a rotten background and a rotten grandfather. How in the world did he hit the deck running to serve the Lord and turn the nation back? Somebody had an influence on him. I think I told you I thought it was his mother. Later on, Joash, coming out of the worst period in Judah's history where Athaliah, Ahab's daughter, ruled the country, idolatry was rampant, murder was everywhere, and Joash is saved. And he's the next good king. He turns things around. Why? There's a turning point influencer in his life. It was a nurse, an unnamed, no-name servant, probably a slave, who, when Athaliah, the queen, went to kill all her rivals, and she sent the soldiers throughout the palace to slit the throats of every child, every parent, every relative of the king's, so that she alone would be the ruler. And this girl spirited this little baby out of the palace and went into the temple, and with a priest's help, they hid that child for 6 years before they declared him king and then turned everything around. And Joash became a good king for a good season. Notice these people aren't kings. They're not queens. They're not great people. This nurse, we don't have any idea who she was. I'm eager to learn. Or maybe the mother of Asa, or maybe some mentor. You and I have the ability to influence people in that way. And I think we should be turning point influencers. I want to quit here real quick. In our day, Chuck Colson, Robbie George at Princeton, and many others got together and they wrote what's called the Manhattan Declaration. I want to read you the end of it because this is in the spirit and mind of Elijah. Because we honor justice and the common good, we will not comply with any edict that purports to compel our institutions to participate in abortions, embryo destructive research, assisted suicide, and euthanasia, nor any other anti-life act, nor will we bend to any rule purporting to force us to bless immoral sexual partnerships, treat them as marriages or the equivalent, or refrain from proclaiming the truth as we know it about morality, immorality, and marriage and the family. We will fully and ungrudgingly render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but under no circumstances will we render to Caesar what is God's. Do we need a prophet? Yeah. Can we be turning point influencers? Yeah, you can. I wonder how many of you have gone online to read that and signed it. I recommend you do. That's one thing we can do.
That was like 2 years ago.
Oh, no, more like 5 or 10. Yeah, it's quite a ways back. That's truly in the spirit of Elijah. And so we're going to get into Elijah and the effect he had on Judah, and particularly on Israel and on Ahab. And we'll learn everything from this point on for the next 6 or 7 weeks. We'll be pretty much talking about Elijah.